Hi, I'm Elliot Berman from AML RightSource, and I'm here with my colleague Jeff Fischer, who's a director in our Financial Crimes Advisory Group. And we're here for another conversation about risk assessments. Jeff, it's good to be back with you, and let's dive right in.
Sounds great, Elliot. Great to be back with you today as well. Thank you.
There's certainly a growing interconnectivity between fraud and money laundering. And when we start to think about risk assessments, how do we think about assessing that interconnectivity in a risk assessment process?
It's a great point, Elliot. I think most people in the industry are familiar with the phrase FRAML, the merging of fraud and AML, and where there's a lot of crossover and I think a lot more time and attention being paid to that. And I think to your point, there is certainly an indication that AML risk assessments are starting to consider fraud risks and controls. When we think about it, fraud can be a precursor to money laundering. For example, if we think of fraud such as identity theft or phishing, account takeover could potentially be used to facilitate money laundering or some other type of illicit financial activity. So fraud vulnerabilities could create weaknesses in an organization's AML controls, which would potentially make it easier to launder money. So addressing fraud vulnerabilities strengthens the overall financial crime prevention efforts for a specific organization that's performing the risk assessment. And I think it also aligns with the importance of good communication, good collaboration within organizations that are dealing with fraud and dealing with AML. And as I mentioned, the FRAML approach, making sure that there is that collaboration, there is that discussion, and that as an organization, it's not just being viewed in its own individual silos of AML looks at AML, fraud looks at fraud, but that there is some conversation and understanding of where there are those intersections and that those risks are properly vetted within an organization and certainly within the risk assessment process, as you alluded to.
That also helps the organization avoid the finger pointing of, I thought they were looking at that. Oh, I thought you were looking at that. Where there's that little bit of overlap or big overlap, irrespective of magnitude, making sure that the groups are talking to each other and considering the things that are in that common zone gives you a much better process and avoids unintended oopses.
Yeah, I thought they were looking at it. We weren't supposed to look at it. And then At the end of the day, nobody's looking at it and everybody loses out in that circumstance.
So a lot of risk assessments appropriately take a look at forward-looking trends. How do you think organizations should incorporate the evolving regulatory landscape in their risk assessments?
Yeah, Elliot, I think ideally institutions should really be adopting both a proactive and a continuous approach where they're periodically reviewing existing policies, procedures, assessment methodologies, to see what is still applicable and what may have evolved or changed since the last review. That's probably something that should occur at least annually. If there's more hot button topics, maybe it's a little bit more frequently, maybe it's twice a year, maybe it's once a quarter, but at least annually organizations should be looking internally and critically challenging where they are, asking questions. Are there new regulations that need to be considered? Are there other aspects of the risk assessment methodology that need to be refined? Is there technology or possibly automation that could help us stay current with regulatory updates? So asking some of those kinds of questions and dusting it off and making sure that there's some critical challenge of what are we doing and making sure that's done frequently and not every couple years.
And you mentioned changes in regulation. If a major change in regulation occurs, it may prompt what I'll call off-cycle update of the risk assessment. Because depending on when it goes effective and things like that, then you'll have a revised control environment and things like that to meet the challenges of the new regulation. And those need to be looked at from a risk assessment perspective, not just tested from an internal audit perspective.
Absolutely. No, that's a very good point.
So risk assessments also need to have a quantitative as well as qualitative component to them. How do you advise clients when you talk about the data that should be involved. And I make the distinction between data and information because there's lots of stuff floating around organizations. There's a lot of information out there that may or may not be helpful and really add to a true analysis. So how do you make that distinction and how do you figure out what you want to be sure you're gathering, what's nice to have and what's
Yeah, I think to that point, Elliot, it might touch back actually on something that we talked about a little bit in the first podcast as it relates to methodology, being able to document in that methodology, what are the quantitative factors that we need to pull in? What is the quantitative support that we're looking to pull to be able to inform whether it's inherent risk scoring or control mitigation effectiveness? What are those quantitative metrics that actually, to your point, matter and are important versus the noise that people are going to throw at you and say, oh, will this be helpful or not? In many cases, it may not be. So I think the quantitative support certainly needs to be documented and a good understanding of what are we asking for? What are we seeking? The risk assessment is certainly a collaborative process. So when dealing with whether it's a data analytics team or other types of data members within the organization that might be pulling or generating some of that data, it's important to, as I mentioned with the methodology, very specific of what are we looking for? What do we need so that they can pull the most meaningful quantitative support that's going to help us go through and execute the risk assessment. I think ultimately the importance of quantitative support is certainly being able to not just say it feels this way, it feels that way, but moving beyond the qualitative to the quantitative. And I think the one analogy I sometimes like to use is it's almost like going back to high school algebra of don't just give me your answer, but show me your work, show me how you got there. And so if you have that good quantitative support, you're able to do that. And again, if you've asked very explicitly, data colleagues, this is what I need pulled, this is the data that's going to help me understand my inherent risk, understand my control environment, and understand if the inherent risk is high or moderate or low. And same thing with the controls to understand, are they strong? Are they sufficient? Are they in need of improvement, et cetera, to allow you to have that show me your work proof of how we got from A to Z and how we arrived at whatever the scoring may be or the result may be. And it's more than just, that's where we were and nothing's really changed, so it must still be the same. But being able to show, document, and demonstrate that quantitative support is certainly an important and valuable story to be able to tell. The only thing I will kind of caveat that with at the end, though, with data, as I think all organizations know, it's all about the quality of your data. If the data is bad and it's unreliable, unfortunately, the conclusions that you might be reaching coming out of that process may also be unreliable. So I think it also goes back to, again, that holistic compliance risk management view of collaboratively working to try and make sure that the data is as accurate as possible, because ultimately, if you have bad data, you might ultimately get results that are not accurate or not in alignment with what is really happening within your organization or your institution.
Every organization that I've ever either worked at or worked with has always had a couple of people in it who have a sense of the organization beyond the data, if you will. And having those people around when risk assessments are done and lots of other things too can be really helpful, because sometimes their gut reaction can actually cause you to go take another look at the data, because I can't tell you why, but that just doesn't feel right. We couldn't possibly have that many transactions or that kind of thing. It's a goofy process tip, but I think it's important to know who those people are and keep them in the loop, because they can be your ultimate double check on the formula's wrong in a spreadsheet kind of thing.
Yep. That gives you that smell check, and then also just to keep you honest as well. And to your point, somebody that can come in and knows the stuff cold and can effectively challenge pretty quickly, hey, you're on the right track, or we're missing something. Let's look at this again.
Yes. Within the financial crime prevention community, one of the topics that's certainly being discussed a lot is dynamic risk assessment, an ongoing risk assessment process, live dashboards and things like that, all of which I think are really valuable. But Where does that fit into this overall conversation about risk assessments? And is that the future of risk assessments?
In an ideal setting, Elliot, absolutely. The ability to have risk assessments that are not just a point in time view of the risk, but are able to look at things more dynamically and more real time, certainly I think is where we want to be going and want to be heading. I think some of it would depend, and not just so much on maybe risk assessment tools, but even maybe in the current day of certain enhancers to existing data feeds and information data that you're pulling through the risk assessment, of being able to, say, for example, Tableau as a dashboard that you could set on something and be able to get some nice outputs of charts or graphs to give you a visual picture of the data and what it looks like. Some of that certainly, I think, depends on the compatibility of existing data systems that would be used to pull some of the data for risk assessments and whether or not they would align with something like a Tableau. But there's also companies and organizations that are developing more automated risk assessment platforms that allow a more technology-enabled approach to executing risk assessments across any host of different topic areas, whether it's BSA AML, OFAC sanctions, fraud, cybersecurity, third-party risk, et cetera. We're heading in that direction to be in a position where you can look at and not just say, oh, well, we're going to get a point in time risk assessment and our risk assessment data, and our results are as of December 31 of 2024. And here we are maybe in the spring of 2025, and we're reporting on our risk from the last 12 months, which was actually a 12-month period that goes back almost 17 or 18 months by the time we go through and we complete the writing of the report and the finalization and approval process of a risk assessment report, that it might take several months after that review period ends.
So another thing that's being talked about a lot is targeted assessments. And some of those have to do with new product development and new geographic expansion, new markets, things like that. How do you see those working? I'll put my penny's worth in to start. As I think about the more mature and sophisticated product development processes that I've been involved with, the best ones, among other things, had points in time where you had go, no-go decisions, and pretty early on, the risk of the new product or the risk of the geographic expansion were at least considered. Maybe not a full-blown risk assessment, but at least someone said, we ought to figure out whether this thing makes sense from a risk perspective. What do you think about that?
It's a great question, Elliot. And I think there's probably two pieces to start on. I think the first thing, yes, there certainly should be some type of a trigger within the organization that would prompt a more targeted risk assessment if there's going to be a new product or service launched, or there's the thought or the discussion around expanding into a new geographic region or those types of things. And I say that from the standpoint that I think one of the things I've heard from clients over the years is oftentimes BSA AML or the compliance team may be one of the last players to be invited to the table, and they're not as involved as they should be on the front end to make sure that a proper assessment of the risks involved are considered before launching that new product or service or expanding into a new geography. So yeah, I think there certainly needs to be some type of trigger early on in the process. And with that trigger, there also needs to be good communication and transparency internally within the organization. That's a crucial step to make sure that the right players and the right stakeholders come to the table from the very beginning to start the discussion on that new product or service or that geographic expansion, so that everybody's at the table from day one, and BSA AML or other compliance stakeholders aren't getting looped in at the 11th hour and they're getting ready to launch a product. And it's, hey guys, is this okay? We're launching in 2 weeks. Hopefully it looks good to you. And it's something that obviously they've maybe been working on for months. And again, it's compliance, BSA AML, that's the last one to get invited to the party and the last one to have the seat at the table and be able to look at and understand what's going on and what is actually happening here and what is the risk exposure to our organization.
My experience is that good compliance professionals are not looking to be Dr. No. They're looking to help manage risk and that kind of thing. And brought in early, they can be great engineers in making sure that the business goal is met, but the risk is managed. It's harder to say yes when you're given 5 minutes to look at something, but it's a lot easier to be a part of the building process and be comfortable that we've gotten to something that's going to meet a customer need, going to be a revenue driver, and also isn't going to expose us to risks we hadn't anticipated.
Elliot, at that point, I think also it's about having the conversation and being informed on the front end. Again, effectively challenging, hey, does this align with our risk appetite as an organization or no? And also then maybe having the conversations of, but maybe it doesn't. But if we put in these couple of controls or we develop these certain policies or procedures, that would align us in a better position to be able to appropriately and effectively and proactively manage that risk. And again, to your point, if you're able to have that conversation early on and not at the 11th hour, you're in a better position to put together a thoughtful, proactive approach that is integrated and collaboratively reached within the organization that I think ultimately gives everyone a better outcome at the end of the day.
It's clear from our conversation that the risk assessment process can be a big, complex, sometimes a little bit lumbering operation. How do you make the process for performing risk assessments more efficient and still fully effective?
Yeah, it's probably the $1,000,000 question, Elliot, because it is still, I think for most organizations, it's a relatively long, arduous process that probably most people, if they were speaking honestly, would tell you it's one of the things they least like to do during the course of the year, because it does take a lot of time. It does require pulling in a lot of different stakeholders across the institution. And I think in terms of making it more efficient, I think in today's day and age, as we continue to see technological advances around automation and technology-enabled risk assessment platforms is certainly one way to do that. But I think also even leveraging technology in the data collection process, pulling in some of that data during the risk assessment process, conducting some of the analysis, some of the collaboration, possibly having automated questionnaires that can be sent out to different stakeholders that need to provide either quantitative or qualitative information relating to the risk assessment via those automated questions might cut down on some of the manual processes that takes a lot of time, creates inefficiencies in the risk assessment process, and certainly can be a challenge for day-to-day stakeholders who obviously also have their day jobs and other responsibilities that they're trying to balance in addition to performing the risk assessment.
Jeff, I appreciate another great conversation about risk assessments, and I look forward to the next opportunity that you and I have to chat.
Thanks, Elliot. Appreciate the time today. Look forward to talking to you again soon.